When it comes to creativity, we all have those moments where we really just don't feel inspired and don't know how to write the next piece of music that we're going to write. So today I want to go over 5 different things that you can do in your workflow to actually get the ball rolling and to get creative again when starting off a new idea. So the big thing that I need at the beginning of a project for me to get back to it is an immediate connection with the project. And that can be either through one element sounding really, really cool, or we can create those kind of things kind of artificially. For example, what can be cool is to create a mood board for your track and just capturing a whole bunch of different images and maybe just even some thoughts in text and just putting that in one image. And while you're working on this project, make that image the background for your computer desktop. That way, what's going to happen is that every time you close out of a different program, you're going to have that little moment where you remember the track that you're working on. And that way, even when you're not actively working on a track, when you have something else to do on your computer, you get those moments where you start to think about the track. And those are also the moments where you start to make decisions on what the track actually needs to do and how it needs to progress. And then once you have time to actually work on it again, then you can implement those things that you have picked up on while you're away from producing. So maybe going through Midjourney and generating a whole bunch of different images can really help with this kind of stuff. And it allows you to go for the images that point out the exact moods that you're going for with your track. And not only that, maybe you'll also find the cover art for when you finally finish the track and you want to release it, if you ever get to that point. By the way, another place where you can put images if you want to keep the same mood for the track while you're working on it through different sessions is a software like DB Done over here. This is the organizational software that I use for all of my projects. And right now it just assigns random images, but for any track that you may be working on, you can of course put the exact cover art that you want there. The second point that I want to go into is doing sound design sessions. This is kind of like creating a mood board, but just for the actual sounds. What you're going to do is you're going to make very long files of just experimentation with synths. And I have a couple of different examples of that here. If I go into my samples and then this jam session here, these are these kind of samples, which is just one synth playing a whole bunch of different variations in a particular key, in a particular BPM. So as you can hear, a whole bunch of different cool sounds, and I can now use those and just start chopping them up and arranging them. And usually that is a much faster method than having to sound design everything from scratch while you're actually in the project, while you're in the writing stage of your project. So what you're essentially doing is you're creating enough synths, enough material to last you one entire track, and you just store that in audio files. That way you can just chop out every little bit that you need. And usually this leads to a lot of focus on the exact arrangement of these synths and a lot more about building character around the grooves that they create when you start to lay out sequences with this. I've talked about this before in another video, so I'm not going to go over the exact workflow here, but you can just imagine if you're working on a project that is 180 BPM in D sharp, that you just drag in one of these samples and chop out the exact bits that you need for if you're making a one shot or if you're making a sequence. And honestly, spending a day making these files is all that you need to work on an entire song. And that way, the next days, you can probably just work on getting all of these sound design ideas to actually sit in a track and in an arrangement. And for me personally, that is really where the fun part of writing is. So you basically get to spend more concentrated time doing that. Now, another way to avoid sound design altogether is just to go in to a synth. For example, say that I'm looking for a sequence in Omnisphere, say like an ARP or something like that. I can go into the ARPs and BPM category, and instead of browsing for presets or sound designing something yourself, you just click on this randomizer over here, and you allow yourself, say 5 to 10 presets to actually choose from, and you just have to pick the best one. In this case, if I had to pick one of these sounds, I would go with the very first one and start maybe writing a drop around that or developing an idea from that. And just taking presets like this and kind of outsourcing the choices to a randomly generated sequence to just give you, say, 5 to 10 presets. Again, that is a nice range to choose from, so that you still have a little bit of choice and you don't feel overwhelmed if the very first sound that you click is something really, really weird. You can imagine that the other way would be to just say, okay, I'm going to randomize it and whatever it lands on, that is what I'm going to use as a sound, but that can be too restricting in cases. So for that reason, having a small range that restricts the number of choices that you have to make, but not to the point where it sometimes feels like you're forced to work with a sound, that is going to be where a lot of creativity is going to shine. Hey, do you want cool products like preset packs and sample packs for your music production? Have you considered checking out my Gumroad or Payhip page or the Adrenochrome store for my products? Because they're currently on sale. There's going to be an image explaining the whole deal with the dates and the promo codes and everything that you need to do. But I haven't made that yet as of recording, so I'll make that later and then just throw it in there in the edits. But that's going to be everything. I hope that you enjoy your purchases if you made some. And of course, they help support the channel as well, so thank you for that. And now let's get back into the actual video again. Now, as you can hear, a lot of the things that I'm talking about is talking about stuff like main sequences and sound design. And to a certain extent, that is going to include like atmospheres, maybe some vocals, maybe some other stuff, but usually not stuff like the kick and the bass and the drums. And that is because I am pretty sure of what I want from those. They just kind of have to do their function. Yeah, sometimes I have a little bit of a different bass line if I want to try something like a groove or something like that. But usually my kick and bass, I make that within 5 minutes when I start writing the track. And I also try to lay out as much of the structure as I know. Only then go I into the majority of the ideas that you see happening in here. And what that means is that I spend most of the time in the phase where you're going to get bored from a project, where you have to really sit down and kind of chew through it and work through it, working on the most fun elements to work on, because it's all going to be like main stuff and the actual musical idea that is happening here. And I don't have to really worry about the arrangement, which I've already done, or just knowing that the kick and bass is going to be done. Of course, later on, I'll go through and make my final kick and bass, and I'll make my final drums, and I'll put more effects on it, and I'll put more care into the arrangement and all of the individual fills and all of the individual transitions that are happening on top of these drums and kick and bass and that kind of stuff. And I might also add more different drums in here, like a drum fill or just percussions or drum loops that are going to play in certain parts of the track. But the main structure that I'm going to stick to for the final track is probably going to be very close to the structure that I lay out at the beginning. And that way I get to, as I said, spend the rest of the project just developing elements and trying to fit them into an arrangement, as opposed to building out the arrangement and making arrangement decisions together with the actual elements that I'm creating and the sound design that I'm doing, so that I kind of don't have to worry about two things at once again. And that really comes to one of the main principles of what I want to talk about today, and that is that for me personally, it is really nice to just focus on one particular thing at the time. That's why I have this really nice structured workflow, but that is also why I, for example, mix in a different Reaper project, and then I master in a different project still. Whenever I'm working on different parts of the track creation process, I want to be really focused on just that process. And that means that whenever I'm working on that, the particular part of my brain that is getting creative for that process, gets turned on and it starts working and it starts doing its thing, and I make the decisions that I usually end up liking. Now, the last part that I want to talk about is that you can do the same thing with the sound design also for the vocals. And I found that the vocal theming is usually a little bit more important than the exact synths that you come up with, at least in terms of getting a connection with the track and writing something that really means something to you. Because of course, when it comes to vocals, when it comes to the spoken words, there is a little bit more of a literal meaning behind that than usually happens with synth sounds. So finding a good vocal for your track before the track even starts is definitely a way of making sure that it has a nice big emotional impact on you and that you can keep writing on it because of that reason. So that would be my final workflow implementation. Of course, you can combine all these 5 together if you want to in ways that may fit your workflow. Depending on what you're going to struggle with and what you're going to need, different things may work differently for you. But I hope that does help you with your creativity and that you get a little bit of a boost of inspiration from this video. If I did teach you anything, make sure that you leave a like on this video because that does really help the channel. Finally, check out the sale that I'm currently running on all of the different platforms that I'm on. You can find links to all 3 of my shop platforms in the description. So thanks if you do that. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.